you. Thank you, Marta. It's really a pleasure to be here, so thanks for the invitation. These are my disclosures. Fewer than the average cardiologist, I think, so there's no problem. But I do have a problem with the title, the European perspective. Because, as you know, Europeans and Americans agree on most things. And even if we disagree on very minor aspects, then we let us know in a very subtle fashion. So we don't need another presentation of 30 minutes on the same topic. So I think this will be a better title, a dreamer's perspective, and I will come back to that later, why it may be just a dream and not reality. But the first question is, of course, do we need additional stroke treatments? Because we already have aspirin, we have thrombolysis with alteplase, we have intra-arterial treatment, and for patients with intracerebral hemorrhage, we have blood pressure reduction. Gives a very small effect, so that's why it's depicted very small. And indeed, if you look at patients treated with intravenous alteplase within 3 hours of stroke onset, you can see that the estimate is on the favorable side of the line of no effect. It clearly favors thrombolysis. But if you look at the actual numbers, you can see that in the patients treated with thrombolysis within 3 hours of stroke onset, still about 59% will have a poor outcome, will be dead or dependent at the end of follow-up. And this was fewer than patients in the control group. There was 68%, but so there is a large risk reduction, but it's not something you would like to tell to your patients, that it doesn't work in the majority of patients. And something similar happens with intra-arterial treatments. This is a figure from a meta-analysis of trials with testing intra-arterial treatments. And this shows the distribution of the scores on the modified Rankin scale, which is the primary outcome measure in most stroke trials. And here for the control population, here for the intervention population. And if you have a score of 0 on the left, you've recovered completely. And if you have a score of 6 on the right, then you're dead. And if you look at the patients who are dead or dependent at the end of follow-up, with a score of 3 to 6, you can see that intra-arterial treatment is indeed of benefit. It reduces the risk of death or dependency by some 19%. But still about 50% of the patients have a poor outcome despite intra-arterial treatment. And what's even more important is that only a minority of the patients is eligible for one of these treatment strategies. About 20% for intravenous thrombolysis and about 10% for intra-arterial treatment. And that's because they arrive too late, or for intra-arterial treatment because they don't have an occlusion of a major intracranial artery. So additional treatment options are indeed needed. And I discussed this with Professor Hopkins before. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend his lecture yesterday, but we agreed that to avoid too much overlap, he would focus on the reperfusion and I would focus on neuroprotection. And that's different neuroprotection than you usually see with cardiac interventions. So I don't mean placing something somewhere in your aorta, but I mean protecting neurons from injury or degeneration from a pathological point of view, or from a clinical point of view, keeping neuronal and glial damage under the threshold of symptom manifestation. And this can be aimed at different targets. And here you can see the targets. You don't need to learn them by heart, but for example, the neurons, endothelium, the immune cells, the pericytes, at the blood vessels, so different targets for neuroprotection. And of course, reperfusion is the best way to offer neuroprotection, if it started early. But I will focus on specific treatment strategies that are targeted at, for example, the activation of glutamate receptors, the influx of intracellular calcium, the formation of radicals. And I will go back to 1994 when I was still a resident in neurology and became the local clinical coordinator of the Trilizet efficacy stroke study, TESS. This was a randomized, double-blind, international clinical trial in patients with acute ischemic stroke, testing Trilizet versus placebo. The target recruitment was 900 patients, and this trial was coordinated and sponsored by the company Upjohn. And Trilizet was a 21 amino steroid, and as such a radical scavenger. And what is important is that it was highly effective in animal models. That's something you should remember. And it was therefore nicknamed a Lazaroid. And of course this was after Lazarus, who was raised from the grave by Jesus. So the company thought that all stroke patients would raise from their beds like Lazarus was raised from the grave after they received this treatment. And to be honest, I quite enjoyed the trial because we had investigator meetings in the Carlton Hotel in Cannes, as in Mediterranean, where there were really no limits on expensive wines, champagne, caviar, like the average cardiology meeting probably, because the company thought this compound would be a blockbuster. But 5 trials and 6 years later, Trilizet proved to be ineffective in a meta-analysis. It's on the wrong side of the line of no effect. So in fact, it's detrimental. And unfortunately, this is not the only example of a failed translation. This compound was very effective in animal models, but not in clinical trials. And I know something similar happened with Cardioprotection. So by 2006, over 1,000 different treatments had been tested in animal models of cerebral ischemia, and about 600 in animal models of focal cerebral ischemia, so mimicking stroke. And these included the usual suspects, Martha's usual suspects, antioxidants, calcium antagonists, anti-inflammatory agents, and thrombolytic drugs, but also more obscure agents like Polynesian ceremonial beverages, aged garlic, sea snail peptides, and the inevitable ginkgo biloba extracts. And remarkably, almost everything worked, or at least 2/3 of these treatments worked, and the ones I mentioned really worked. About 100 have been tested in clinical trials, and only one of these treatments was effective in clinical trials, and that was alteplase. And it was not developed in animal models, but it was developed by the cardiologists. There were also 2 treatments that worked and that were not tested in animal models, and that were aspirin and stroke unit care. So there's a large gap between the laboratory and the clinic, and it's maybe explained by the limitations in the clinical trials. They were often underpowered and most often started treatment far too late. But there were also limitations in the animal studies. A poor methodology, so poor internal validity, and a poor generalizability or external validity. And there's a lot of publication bias in the laboratory field. So it's much easier to publish a study that was positive than if it was neutral or negative. And I will briefly focus on the limitations of the animal studies, also because I think these apply to studies in the field of cardiology, animal studies. And with respect to the internal validity, I will focus on randomization, blinded outcome assessment, and sample size calculation. And as you may know, randomization has been used in clinical trials since 1948. And the main advantage is that it eliminates selection bias. Blinding is much older, and you may know that this man first introduced blinding of experiments into medicine. Who knows this man? Yes, it's also in the banknotes. So it's Benjamin Franklin, indeed, and remarkably he was the ambassador, he has been the ambassador to the United States in France for some time. So he had a remarkable career. And he was appointed head of a committee by this man, Louis XVI, the 16th Louis. They had a committee to assess the effects of mesmerism or animal magnetism. And this was a treatment which was very popular at the time in Paris, actually invented by an Austrian, Dr. Mesmer. So it's a real European treatment. And the doctors and the patients thought that if you would magnetize a patient with your hands by making certain movements, then all complaints would disappear. And it worked in many patients, but there was some doubt on whether this was realistic. So there were also other members, well-known members in this committee, Antoine Lavoisier, who discovered oxygen, Joseph Ignace Guillotin, and the astronomer Jean-Sébastien Bailly. And what was the good thing about this committee is that they used blindfolding of patients to test the effects of mesmerism. And they found that if they use this in non-blinded patients, so if they did this magnetism, then this worked at a large benefit. But if they blinded the patients, then there was no difference between a sham procedure and a true magnetism. So this means that the treatment just didn't work and was just because the patients thought it would work. So this was the first study, at least I know of, in which blinding was used. So, and of course nowadays this is most often used in clinical trials, and we assessed whether this was also used in animal studies that formed the basis of clinical trials in humans. And we used 8 systematic reviews involving 318 animal studies involving over 11,000 animals. And we found that randomization was used in 1/3, blinded outcome assessment also in about 1/3, and sample size calculation in 3% of the studies. So you can say that these were of poor methodological quality. So what about the generalizability? You will know this also in cardiology. Experiments are usually performed in young, healthy male rats or mice. And this would be similar as testing a stroke patient in a clinical trial in these young boys who were inbred for generations, but and who had lived in a cage for many years, but on an enriched diet, fortunately. Whereas, of course, these are the patients who have the strokes. These are elderly patients with comorbidities, and there are also females who have a stroke. So the generalizability of the studies was often poor. But the question is, does this study quality matter? Maybe it doesn't. And I will focus on randomization and blinding. And I will explain something about a systematic review and meta-analysis of the compound NXY059 for stroke. We tested this in animal studies, but this is not an obscure agent. This has been tested in very large clinical trials that have been performed, a European one and an American one, both published in the New England Journal of Medicine, now about 10 years ago. So tested in thousands of patients. And we checked whether in the animal studies, studies that were not randomized had a larger effect size than studies that were randomized. And we found that, indeed, studies that were not randomized had a much larger effect than studies that were randomized. And something similar applies to blinded outcome assessment. Studies that were blinded had a smaller effect size than studies that were not blinded in the laboratory. And of course, this is just an association between a poor study quality and a large effect size. And you will know that this is not the same as a causal relationship. And the best explanation for that, or the best example, is this list, which you may know. This shows the, I don't know whether you can read it, but the states of the United States ranked according to their average population IQ. So the usual suspects here are with the high IQ: Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, and the states with the lowest intelligence, I didn't check it, so I don't know whether this is true, were Idaho, Utah, and Mississippi. But it also shows who won the presidential elections in that state in 2004. And in blue, this was John Kerry, and in red, this was George Bush. So this suggests that there is a causal relationship between intelligence and whom you vote for, but of course this is just an association. And the same applies to the study which I just mentioned. And in fact, there has been very little research into the causality of these study parameters in animal models. And the best one, and in fact one of the only ones, already dates back to 1963. And this was a time, I think, even Petter wasn't a student in medicine yet. And this was a psychological study named The Effect of Experimental Bias on the Performance of the Albino Rat. And it was a study that comprised 12 students and 60 rats. And the students had to train rats on a T-maze task and had to do 10 trials per day for 5 days. I'll show you what a T-maze task is. This is the T. And the rats had to learn that they should always run to the black box here and not to the white box here. So in this case, they should run to the left. And to avoid that, rats would learn that they would always have to run to the left. The boxes could be changed and they could run to the right. And the students were randomized, not the rats. And one group of students were told that they had maze-bright rats, so rats that were bred for generations to be extremely clever and to perform very well on this T-maze task. But also, the other group was randomized to maze-dull rats, so very stupid rats who performed very badly on this task. And the outcome measure was the number of correct responses. And these are the details of a very nice old figure. So you can see that the maze-bright rats indeed performed much better than the maze-dull rats, on this rather objective test. And in a post-experimental questionnaire, the students also thought that the maze-bright rats were cleaner, brighter, more tame and more pleasant to deal with, whereas of course these were exactly the same rats. So the conclusion of this study was that researchers too easily find what they are looking for. You all know that. And that's called detection bias. And this can be solved with blinded outcome assessment. So there are options for improvement. There are reporting guidelines for clinical studies, and the idea is that if you have to report whether it was randomized, blinded, etc., that you also make the methodology of your actual study better. So you know the CONSORT guidelines, but there are similar guidelines for animal studies, not only for stroke, but for any study, the Eurolive guidelines. So, and I've asked, because this is more or less a debate between the Europeans and the Americans, whether Angela Merkel could give a comment on these, on performing animal studies of poor quality, but she was much too busy in her negotiations with Schulz for the German coalition. But fortunately, I got a message from the president to all of those who continue to perform animal stroke studies of poor quality. And that's this one.
They will be met with fire, fury, and frenzy power, the likes of which this world has never seen before. Thank you.
So it's a very clear statement. Angela Merkel could not have said this better. So, what do you think should be requirements for testing in a clinical trial? I think the animal studies should have a good quality of evidence, so randomized, blinded, etc. A broad range of evidence. That means that not only tested in young rats, but also in male and female rats, in rats with comorbidities, older rats, maybe a multi-center phase 3 clinical trial, animal trial. No important impact of publication bias, something you can assess, and benefit under conditions of a clinical trial. So, for example, the treatment should be started not immediately after occlusion, but rather late after occlusion. And of course, it should be safe and feasible. And there are trials underway testing the effect of nitric oxide donors, of radical scavengers, of compounds that stabilize the blood-brain barrier. Sorry, this was mitochondrial damage, blood-brain barrier damage that affect inflammation, and also on several other pathways in this ischemic cascade. We'll discuss a few of them briefly, and the first one is hypothermia. And it's mainly because this is theoretically the best neuroprotective treatment. And that's because in magnesium, which is also neuroprotectant, affects only a single step in the ischemic cascade. It's only reduces the magnesium, increases the magnesium block, and reduces the activation of glutamate receptors. Something similar applies to the neuroprotectant nimodipine, because it only reduces the increase in intercellular calcium. And the radical scavengers only affect the radicals, whereas hypothermia affects a wide range of cell death mechanisms and is therefore much more likely to be beneficial. And in systematic reviews of animal stroke models, hypothermia was indeed most robustly effective, about twice as effective as thrombolysis with alteplase. And of course, these are not randomized trials of hypothermia versus TPA, but suggest that hypothermia is very beneficial. It has also been tested in clinical trials in comparable conditions, as you know, post-anoxic encephalopathy and neonatal hypoxic ischemic brain damage. And that was effective, but it was not effective in traumatic brain injury or bacterial meningitis. And also methods to cool stroke patients, awake patients, surface cooling, when you first infuse ice-cold saline to reduce the temperature, and then maintain the temperature with cooling pads, which are probably may be used on your ICU ward for patients who have had a cardiac arrest. You can also do intravascular cooling by inserting a catheter into the inferior vena cava, and through this catheter, cold water flows. And I think it's important that it can be done by a neurologist. So we don't need the interventional neuroradiologist or the cardiologist or the neurosurgeon. There have been clinical trials of cooling in ischemic stroke, but the thing is that these were all very small over a long period of time, and in total just 165 patients cooled. So very little information. They were way too small to assess any effect on outcome, on functional outcome. The only thing they did find consistently was that it increased the rate of pneumonia. Hypothermia, 39% of the patients, and controls 8%. So when your mother used to tell you in the past that when it was cold, you should go outside with a jacket on, because otherwise you would have pneumonia, she was right. But there is a trial ongoing, the Eurolive trial, a randomized multi-center international clinical trial, open with blinded outcome assessment, with a target of 800 patients with ischemic stroke, cooled to 34 to 35 degrees Celsius for 12 hours, started within 6 hours, and still ongoing, but unfortunately rather slowly. First inclusion was already in November 2013 and still not finished. And here, shivering, which is of course a major problem, and discomfort, is treated with the old agents pethidine and buspirone. So isn't there something more simple? also targeted at the temperature. We know that in animal models, fever after stroke caused a major increase in infarct size, 43% increase in infarct size. And in observational studies, higher temperatures have also been associated with, they are very frequent, in 1/3 of the patients on day one, and they've been associated with a poor outcome. And guidelines for stroke treatment therefore recommend, generally, the American ones still do that, the European one need not, recommend treatment of fever. But this may be too late, because before treatment is started, the patient may have had a fever for many hours, and prevention of fever can be better. And this can be done in a very easy way with paracetamol. It has been tested in the PICE trial in the Netherlands. 1,400 patients with acute stroke who received paracetamol 6 grams per day for 3 days versus placebo, started within 12 hours. And they found that body temperature was reduced by a very modest 0.3 degrees Celsius. But the number of patients who had a fever or subfebrile temperature was reduced from 30% to 15%. So paracetamol is able to stabilize, to maintain normothermia in patients with stroke. And there was a modest improvement on functional outcome at 3 months, but it was just not statistically significant. But if it was true, this would be an extremely safe, simple and cheap treatment. It's now tested in a larger European trial, the PRECIOUS trial, 2x2 factorial in 3,800 patients with ischemic stroke or intracerebral hemorrhage. Open treatment, testing several drugs that might reduce the risk of infections and therefore fever or fever alone. Ceftriaxone, paracetamol and metoclopramide to prevent aspiration. And the primary endpoint of this trial is again the functional outcome at 90 days, and these are the participating countries. So this has just started. So something more explosive, neuroprotectant, that's nitroglycerine, or glyceryl trinitrate, and now you know much more of this compound than I do. It's an O donor, a systemic and serial vasodilator, and NO donors in animal studies have shown that they increase cerebral blood flow and reduce infarct size. And the idea is that this could be used in patients with acute stroke, because in this patient who has a very large infarct here with no perfusion at all, you could improve collateral blood flow. And this has been tested in the so-called ENOS trial, published 2 years ago in the Lancet. And this forest plot shows the effect in several subgroups. And if you use your binoculars, you will see immediately that here the estimate of efficacy was 1, so it has had no effect at all. But this was because patients could be treated up to 48 hours after stroke onset. And if you look at the subgroup where they looked at different points in time of randomization, here, then you can see that indeed, if treatment was started after 6 hours, there was no benefit, but if treatment was started within 6 hours, then there was a large benefit. Nitroglycerin has also been tested in an ambulance trial, also in the United Kingdom, in the RIGHT trial. Just 41 patients who were given nitroglycerin in the ambulance before they arrived in the hospital. And this showed that it was feasible and safe. It gave a reduction in blood pressure of about 25 millimeters of mercury. And here's again the distribution of scores on a modified Rankin scale. And if we look at the patients who have a poor outcome, and there are fewer patients in this very small trial who have a poor outcome when treated with nitroglycerin than controls. And of course this trial is much too small, with 41 patients, to extrapolate to usual clinical practice, but it's very promising. What's also promising is that there's a biological plausibility. Almost, okay, just a few slides. Yeah. So it works better if the treatment is started very early. So here it shows the risk of a poor outcome, and this is lower the earlier you start it. So there are now two phase 3 trials, one in the UK, one in the Netherlands, where patients are treated in the ambulance with nitroglycerine if they have suspected strokes. Dose of 5 milligrams per day versus standard care, started within 4 hours in the UK or 3 hours in the Netherlands. So, in conclusion, neuroprotection is not dead in my view. Translation from bench to bedside may improve with a better interaction between the laboratory and the clinic, and promising treatments are currently tested in clinical trials. And in this way, I think we can find a truly new laseroid. Thank you for your attention. I would like to invite you to the European Stroke Organization conference, which will be held in Gothenburg in May this year. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bas, for this really excellent overview of the path to where we stand right now. And I know from many disputes or discussions that the way of animal studies not translating to the benefit that we were expecting for so many trials, so many promising compounds is really sort of a disappointment. But we still need to go on to find better ways. And so this presentation is open for discussion. Any questions from the floor?
Well, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. One of the things that I'm missing in your presentation that you focused on neuroprotection and not neurorecovery. I think that we have to differentiate. And in my opinion, most of the focus was really on protecting the neurons from dying in the acute state, and not necessarily maybe a continuum of this is the neurorecovery in the later stage. And can you comment?
Yeah, no, you're completely right. Of course, it would be very good if you could have treatment strategies that allow recovery of neurons after a stroke. Now, I had to focus on something, so I only focused on the acute state. There have been several treatment strategies tested in animal models and also in clinical trials, also in disappointing clinical trials that tested recovery. But my preference is for the acute states to prevent neuronal death, because once the neurons are dead, they will never be resurrected from their graves again. So I prefer to minimize damage in the acute states. And of course, there will always be patients who arrive in the hospital way too late. And for these patients, and also for the patients who have an unsuccessful recanalization, recovery of neurons in the next weeks, maybe it could be beneficial. But no, people are also working on that.